And the next morning we rode. Yes, I could ride, and yet it was the first time I'd ever been on a horse. I don't understand how that can be in Nangiala. Yet that you can do everything, I mean. I galloped about as if I had never done anything else. But to see Jonathan when he rode, the woman who thought that my brother looked like a saga prince, she should have been with us as he went dashing along on his horse over the fields in Cherry Valley. Then she would have seen a saga prince that she'd never forget. Oh, when he came at a full gallop and jumped over the stream as if flying, so that his hair flowed around him. Yes, then you really could believe that he was a saga prince. He was almost always dressed like that, or maybe more like a knight. There was a cabinet full of clothes at Knight's farm, wherever they had come from, and they weren't at all like the ones we have nowadays, but just like Knight's clothes. We had picked out some for me too. I'd thrown away my ugly old rags, and I never wanted to see them again, because Jonathan said we must dress so that it suited the time we lived in now, or else the people in Cherry Valley would think we were strange. The days of campfires and sagas, wasn't it just as Jonathan had said? As we rode around in our handsome knight's clothes, I asked him, "Are these terribly olden days that we live in here in Nagyala?" "You could say that perhaps in some ways," said Jonathan. "Certainly they are olden days for us, but you can also say that they are young days." He thought for a while. "Yes, that's it," he said. "A young and healthy and good time. That is easy and simple to live in." But then his eyes darkened. "At least here in Cherry Valley," he said. "Is it different in other places?" I asked, and Jonathan said that it certainly could be different in other places. What luck that we had ended up here, right here in Cherry Valley, where life was as easy and simple as Jonathan had said. It couldn't be easier or simpler or more fun than on such a morning as this. First you wake up, sitting in the kitchen, as the sun shines through the windows, and the birds chirping happily in the trees outside, and you see Jonathan working quietly and setting out bread and milk on the table to eat, and when you're done eating, you go out and feed your rabbits and groom your horse, and then you ride off. Oh, you ride off, and there's dew on the grass that just glitters and shines everywhere, and bees buzzing around the cherry blossoms, and your horse gallops away, and you're hardly scared at all. Just think, you're not even scared that it will all suddenly come to an end, as fun things usually do. Not in Nagyala, not here in Cherry Valley at least. We rode for a long time over the fields, here and there as they came. Then we followed the path along the stream, twisting and turning, and suddenly we saw the morning smoke from the village down in the valley. At first just the smoke, and then the whole village, with its old houses and farms. We heard roosters crowing, and dogs barking, and sheep and goats bleating. All the sounds of morning. The village was probably just now waking. A woman with a basket on her arm came toward us on the path. She was probably a peasant woman, neither young nor old, but a little bit in between, and brown-skinned like you become when you're out in all kinds of weather. She was dressed old-fashioned, like in the sagas. "Oh, Jonathan, your brother has arrived now, at last," she said, with a friendly smile. "Yes, he's here now," said Jonathan, and you could hear that he thought it was good. "Scotty, this is Sophia," he said then, and Sophia nodded. "Yes, I'm Sophia," she said. "It's so good that I met you. Now you can take the basket yourselves." And Jonathan took the basket as if he were used to doing that, and he didn't need to ask what was in it. Take your brother with you to the Golden Cockerel this evening, so that everyone can welcome him," said Sophia. Jonathan said he would do that, and then we said good-bye to her and rode home. I asked Jonathan what the Golden Cockerel was. "The Golden Cockerel Inn," said Jonathan. "It's an inn down in the village. We meet there and talk of things we want to talk about." I thought it would be fun to accompany him to the Golden Cockerel in the evening and see what kind of people lived in Cherry Valley. I wanted to know everything about Cherry Valley and Nangiala. I wanted to see if it was on target with what Jonathan had said. I thought of a question and reminded him of it while we rode before I forgot. "Jonathan, you said that in Nangiala you could have adventures from morning till evening, and at night too. Do you remember that? But it's so calm here, and there are no adventures at all." Then Jonathan laughed. "It was only yesterday that you arrived. Have you forgotten? Silly, you've hardly had time to stick your nose in yet. You'll have plenty of time for adventures." And I said, when I got my thoughts straight, that it was adventurous and marvelous enough that we had Knight's farm and our horses and rabbits and everything. I didn't need any more adventures. Then Jonathan looked at me so strangely, almost as if he felt sorry for me, when he said, "Well, you know, Scotty, I wish that you could have it just like that, because you may know there are adventures that should not happen." When we got home, Jonathan unpacked Sophia's basket on the kitchen table. There was a loaf of bread in it, and a bottle of milk, and a little jar of honey, and a few crepes. "Does Sophia supply us with food?" I asked in surprise. Clearly, I hadn't thought about how we would get anything to eat. "Sometimes she does that," said Jonathan. "For free?" I asked. "Free, well, you might call it that," said Jonathan. "Everything is free here in Cherry Valley. We give to each other and help each other when it's needed." "Do you give Sophia something then?" I asked. Then he laughed again. "Yes, but that's not a problem," he said. "Horse manure for her flower beds, among other things. I look after them for her for free." And then he said quietly, so that I hardly heard it, "I also do other jobs for her." Just then I saw him take something else out of the basket. It was a little roll of paper, nothing more. He unfolded it and read what was written on it, and then he wrinkled his forehead as if he didn't like what it said. But he said nothing to me, and I didn't want to ask. I thought he would tell me what was on the piece of paper when he wanted me to know. We had an old sideboard in a corner of the kitchen, and the first evening at Knight's farm, Jonathan had told me something about it. There was a secret drawer in the sideboard, he said, one you could neither find nor open if you didn't know the trick. I wanted to see it immediately, of course, but Jonathan said, "Another time, now you should sleep." Then I fell asleep and forgot all about it, but now I remembered it again, because Jonathan went over to the sideboard and I heard some strange little clicks. It wasn't hard to figure out what he did. He hid the note in the secret drawer, and then he locked the sideboard and put the key in an old mortar that stood high up on a shelf in the kitchen. After that, we went swimming for a while, and I dove off the bridge. Just think that I dared to, and then Jonathan made me a fishing pole, similar to what he had himself, and we pulled up some fish, just enough for us to eat for lunch. I got a big perch, and Jonathan got two. We cooked the fish at home in our large fireplace, in a pot that hung on an iron chain over the fire, and when we had eaten, Jonathan said, "Now, Scotty, we'll see if you can hit a target. You'll need to know that sometimes." He took me out to the barn, and in the tack room there hung two bows. I knew that Jonathan had made them, because he always made bows for the neighborhood children at home in town, but these were larger and nicer. They were certainly fine tools. We set up a target on the barn door, and we shot at it the whole afternoon. Jonathan showed me what to do, and I shot quite well, not like Jonathan, of course, because he hit the bullseye almost every time. That was funny about Jonathan. Although he could do everything so much better than me, he didn't think that it was something remarkable. He never bragged, but did everything almost as if he weren't thinking about it. Sometimes I believe he almost wished that I would do better than him. I shot a bullseye one time too, and he looked so glad about it, as if he had gotten a present from me. When it began to get dark, Jonathan said that now it was time now we would visit the golden cockerel. We whistled for Grim and Fyalar. They roamed free in the fields around Knight's farm, but when we whistled they came immediately at a full gallop up to the gate. We saddled them and mounted the horses, and then we rode at a leisurely pace down to the village. Suddenly I felt scared and shy. I was hardly used to meeting people, least of all those who lived here in Nangiala, and I said that to Jonathan. "What are you scared of?" he said. "You don't think there's anyone here who would harm you?" "No, but maybe they'll laugh at me." I thought it sounded silly when I said it, because why should they laugh at me? But I always imagine those kinds of things. "You know, I think we'll begin calling you Carl now, since you're named Lionheart," said Jonathan. "Scotty Lionheart. It might make them laugh. You almost died laughing at it, and so did I." Yes, I really wanted to be called Carl. It sounded much better with my new last name. Carl Lionheart. I tried out how it sounded. "Here ride Carl and Jonathan Lionheart." I thought it sounded good. "Though you're my old Scotty in any case," said Jonathan. "You know that, little Carl." Soon we were down in the village, trotting along the village streets on our horses. It wasn't hard to find the way, because we heard laughter and talking from far away, and we also saw the sign with a large gilded rooster on it. Yes, then, here was the golden cockerel. Just the kind of friendly old inn you used to read about in books. The light was shining so pleasantly out of the little windows. I really felt like finding out what it was like going to an inn, because I'd never done that before. But first we rode into the yard, and we tied Grim and Filar next to many other horses standing there. Jonathan was right when he said that you must have a horse in Nangiala. I think every person in Cherry Valley had come riding in to the Golden Cockerel that evening. The pub was crammed with people when we strode in. Men and womenfolk, large and small, everyone in the village was there, sitting and talking and enjoying themselves, though some small children had already fallen asleep on their parents' knees. How lively it became when we arrived. "Jonathan," they called out. "Here comes Jonathan." The innkeeper himself, he was a large, rosy-faced, rather handsome man. He shouted so that he could be heard all over the noise. "Here comes Jonathan. No, here comes the brothers Lionheart, both of them." He came over and swung me up on a table so that everyone could see me, and I stood there and felt my face become completely red. But Jonathan said, "This is my beloved brother, Carl Lionheart, who has finally arrived. You must be kind to him, as kind as you have been to me." "Yes, you can count on it," said the innkeeper, and he lifted me down again. But before he let me go, he held me in his arms for a moment, and I felt how strong he was. "We two," he said, "will probably be good friends like Jonathan and I. Josie is my name, though I'm mostly called the Golden Cockerel. You can come to the Golden Cockerel whenever you want. Don't forget that, Carl Lionheart." Sophia also sat there at a table all alone, and Jonathan and I sat down by her. She was glad, I think. She smiled so kindly and asked what I thought of my horse, and wondered if Jonathan could come and help her in the garden some day. But then she sat there silently, and I noticed that she was worried about something. I also noticed something else. Everyone sitting there in the pub looked almost a bit reverently at Sophia, and when anyone stood up to go, they always bowed first to our table, just as if there were something special about her. I couldn't understand why. She sat there in her simple clothes, with a veil on her head, and her brown work-roughened hands on her knees, like a common peasant woman. What was it that was so remarkable about her, I wondered. I had fun there at the inn. We sang a lot of songs, some that I knew and some that I had never heard before. Everyone was happy. Or were they? Sometimes I felt that they had hidden problems, just like Sophia. It was as if now and then they thought about something they were scared of, but Jonathan had said that life was so easy and simple in Cherry Valley. What were they scared of? Well, at times they were happy, they sang and laughed, and all were good friends and liked each other, it seemed. But I think they liked Jonathan the most. It was just like at home in town. Everyone liked him, and Sophia, they liked her too, I believe. Though afterward, as Jonathan and I were going home, we went out into the yard to untie our horses, and I asked, "Jonathan, what's really so special about Sophia?" Then we heard a gruff voice beside us say, "Yes, exactly, what's so special about Sophia? I've wondered that for a long time." It was dark in the yard, so I couldn't see who spoke, but suddenly he stepped forward into the light from the window, and I recognized a man who had been sitting near us inside the inn, the one with red, curly hair and a little red beard. I noticed him because the whole time he sat there looking unfriendly, and he didn't sing at all. "Who's that?" I asked Jonathan as we walked out through the door. "His name is Hubbard," said Jonathan, "and he knows very well what's special about Sophia." Then we rode home. It was a cool, starlit night. I've never seen so many stars looking this spectacular. I tried to guess which one was Earth, but Jonathan said, "Earth, oh, it wanders somewhere far, far away in space, and you can't see it from here." That was a little sad, I thought. But then the day came when I found out what was so special about Sophia too. One morning Jonathan said, "Today we're going over to see the Dove Queen for a while." "That sounds fine," I said. "Who is the Dove Queen?" "Sophia," said Jonathan. "The Dove Queen, I call her that just as a joke, and soon I would understand why. It was quite a way to Tulip Farm, where Sophia lived. Her house was on the outskirts of Cherry Valley, with the high mountains behind it. We rode there early in the morning. Sophia stood there feeding her doves, all of her snow-white doves. When I saw them, I remembered her, that white dove that once sat on my window-sill. It seemed like 1,000 years ago. "Do you remember," I whispered to Jonathan, "wasn't it one of these doves that lent you her body the time when you came to me?" "Yes," said Jonathan. "How else could I have come? Only Sophia's doves can fly through the heavens that far so easily." The doves were like a white cloud around Sophia, and she stood there so still amidst the fluttering of their wings, certainly looking like a dove queen, I thought. Then she caught sight of us. She greeted us kindly, as she usually did, but she wasn't happy. She was quite melancholy, and immediately said in a low voice to Jonathan, "I found Violante dead with an arrow in her chest last night up in Wolf Canyon," and the message was gone. Jonathan's eyes darkened. I'd never seen him like that, never so bitter. I didn't recognize him or his voice either. "Then it's as I believed," he said. "We have a traitor in Cherry Valley." "Yes, apparently we have one," said Sophia. I didn't want to believe it, but now I know that it must be true. You could see how sad she was, but she still turned to me and said, "Come, Carl, you should see what I have around here." She lived alone at Tulip Farm, with her doves and her bees and her goats, and with a garden so full of flowers that you could hardly make your way through them. While Sophia went around with me, Jonathan started digging and weeding the way you have to in spring. I looked at everything, Sophia's many beehives, and her tulips and daffodils, and her curious goats, but the whole time I thought about Violante, whoever she was, who had been shot up in the mountains. Soon we went back to Jonathan. He sat there weeding, and his hands had become dirty. Sophia looked at him sadly, and then said, "Listen, my little gardener, I think you must get to work on something else soon." "I understand," said Jonathan. Poor Sophia, she was certainly more worried than she wanted to show. She went and gazed up toward the mountains, looking around so anxiously. I became worried too. What was she looking for? Who was she expecting? Soon I would find out, because suddenly Sophia said, "Here she comes, thank goodness, here's Paloma." It was one of her doves that came flying in. At first she appeared only as a tiny dot up amongst the mountains, but soon she was with us, landing on Sophia's shoulder. "Come, Jonathan," said Sophia hastily. "Yes, but Scotty, Carl," said Jonathan. "He must be told all about it now." "Yes, of course," said Sophia. "Hurry, both of you." With the dove on her shoulder, Sophia ran in front of us into the house. She took us into a little room next to the kitchen, and then she locked the door and closed the shutters. I think she wanted to be sure that no one could see or hear what we were doing. "Paloma, my dove," said Sophia, "do you have a better message with you today than you had last time?" She placed her hand under one of the dove's wings and produced a little capsule. Out of it she took a roll of paper, like the one I had seen Jonathan pick up out of the basket and hide in the sideboard at home. "Read it quickly," said Jonathan. "Quickly, quickly." Sophia read it, then she gave a little cry. "They've taken Orvar too," she said. "Now there's no one left who can really do anything." She held out the note to Jonathan, and when he had read it, his eyes became even darker. "A traitor in Cherry Valley," he said. "Who do you think it is who could be so despicable?" "I don't know," said Sophia. "Not yet, but God help him, whoever he is, when I find out." I sat there listening and not understanding. Sophia sighed, and then she said, "You tell Carl I'll go and make some breakfast for you in the meantime." And she disappeared out into the kitchen. Jonathan sat on the floor with his back against the wall. He sat there quietly and looked at his muddy fingers, but finally he said, "Yes, now you can hear, now that Sophia said I can talk about it. He had told me much about Nangiala, both before I came here and afterward, but nothing like what I was told there in Sophia's room. You remember what I said," he began, "that life here in Cherry Valley is easy and simple. It has been like that, and it should be like that, but it won't be for much longer, because when it becomes tough and difficult over in the other valley, then life becomes difficult in Cherry Valley too, you understand." "Is there more than one valley?" I asked, and then Jonathan told me about Nangiala's 2 green valleys that lay there so prettily between Nangiala's mountains, Cherry Valley and Wild Rose Valley, deep valleys surrounded by mountains, wild towering mountains, which were hard to cross if you didn't know the winding, dangerous little paths. Jonathan said, but the people in the valleys knew the paths and could travel freely to see each other. Or more accurately said, they could before, said Jonathan. No one can escape from Wild Rose Valley now, and no one can go in either, except Sophia's doves. Why is that? I asked. Because Wild Rose Valley is no longer a free land, said Jonathan, because the valley is in enemy hands. He looked at me as if he were sad to have scared me. "And no one knows what will happen with Cherry Valley," he said. Now I was scared. I had gone around so calmly and thought that there wasn't anything dangerous in Nangiala but now I became really scared. "Who is the enemy?" I asked. "Tingil is his name," said Jonathan, and he spoke that name so that it sounded terrible and dangerous. "Where is Tingil?" I asked. Then Jonathan began to tell me about Carmanyaka, the land up in the ancient mountains beyond the ancient rivers, where Tingil rules, cruel as a serpent. I became even more scared, but I didn't want to show it. "Why can't he stay away in his ancient mountains?" I said. "Why must he come to destroy Nangiala?" "Well, you know," said Jonathan, "the one who can answer that can answer much. I don't know why he needs to destroy everything there is. It's just so. He resents the people in the valleys for the lives they lead, and he needs slaves." Then he sat quietly again and stared at his hands, but he mumbled something and I heard it. "The monster he also has Katla. I don't know why I thought it sounded more evil than anything else that he had said, and I asked him, "Who is Katla?" But Jonathan shook his head. "No, Scotty, I know that you're already scared. I don't want to talk about Katla, because then you won't sleep tonight." Instead he told me what was so special about Sophia. "She leads our secret rebellion against Tingil," said Jonathan. "We fight against him, you understand, to help Wild Rose Valley, though we must do it secretly." "But Sophia," I said, "why her?" "Because she is strong and knows things," said Jonathan, "and because she isn't scared at all." "You aren't scared either, Jonathan," I said. He thought for a little while, and then he said, "No, I'm not either." Oh, how I wished that I could be brave like Sophia and Jonathan, but I sat there in the barn so frightened that I really couldn't think. "Sophia's doves, which fly secret messages over the mountains, is this something that everyone knows about?" I asked. "Only those that we can safely rely on," said Jonathan. "But one among them is a traitor, and that's enough." Now his eyes darkened again, and he said so somberly, "Violanta had a secret message with her from Sophia when she was shot last night, and if the message has fallen into Tingil's hands, it means death for many over in Wild Rose Valley. I thought it was terrible that someone could shoot a flying dove so white and innocent, even if she carried a secret message with her. And suddenly I remembered what we had in our sideboard at home. I asked Jonathan why we had secret messages in our kitchen sideboard. Couldn't that be dangerous? "Yes, it's dangerous," said Jonathan, "though it's even more dangerous to leave them with Sophia. Tingil's spies would look there first if they came to Cherry Valley, not at her gardeners." "That was why it was so good," said Jonathan, "that no one knew who he really was except Sophia, that he wasn't just a gardener, but the one closest to her in the fight against Tingil." "Sophia has decided this herself," he said. "She doesn't want anyone here in Cherry Valley to know, and that's why you must swear to keep quiet until the day when Sophia talks about it." And I swore that I'd rather die than betray anything that I had heard. We ate breakfast with Sophia, and then we rode home. There was something else out riding that morning, something we met on the path, just as we left Tulip Farm. The one with the red beard, what was his name again? Hubbard? "So you've been to see Sophia," said Hubbard. "What did you do there?" "Clearing her garden," said Jonathan, as he held up his dirty fingers. "And are you out hunting?" he asked, because Hubbard had his bow and arrows in front of him, on the pommel of his saddle. "Yes, I want to shoot a pair of wild rabbits," said Hubbard. "I thought of our little rabbits at home, and I was happy when Hubbard trotted away on his horse, so that I wouldn't have to look at him any more. Hubbard," I said to Jonathan, "what do you really think of him?" Jonathan thought a little. "He is the most skillful archer in all of Cherry Valley." He didn't say anything else. Then he urged his horse, and we rode on. Jonathan had taken Paloma's message, placing it in a little leather bag under his shirt, and when we got home he put the paper in the secret drawer of the sideboard. But first I got to read what was written. This is what it said. "Orvar was captured yesterday and is now a prisoner in Katla Cavern. Someone in Cherry Valley must have betrayed his hiding place. You have a traitor there. Find out who." "Find out who," said Jonathan. "I wish I could." There was more to the message, but it was written in a secret language I couldn't understand, and Jonathan said that I didn't need to know it. It was only something that Sophia must know. But he showed me how to open the secret drawer. I got to open and close it a couple of times. Then he closed it and locked the sideboard and put the key in the mortar again. The whole day I thought of everything I'd learned, and that night I didn't sleep very well. I dreamed of Tinjil and of dead doves and of the prison in Katla Cavern, and I screamed in my sleep, waking myself up. And then, believe it or not, then I saw someone standing in the dark corner over by the sideboard, someone who became frightened when I called out and disappeared like a dark shadow out through the door, before I'd even really been able to wake up. It happened so quickly I almost thought I had dreamed it all, but Jonathan didn't think so when I woke him and told him about it. "No, Scotty, it wasn't a dream," he said. "It wasn't a dream, it was a traitor." "Tinjil's time will come one day," said Jonathan. We were lying on the green grass down by the stream, and it was one of those mornings when you couldn't believe that Tinjil or any other evil existed in the world. It was completely still and peaceful. The water rippled a little around the stones under the bridge. It was the only thing you could hear. It was pleasant to lie there on your back, only looking at the little white clouds up in the sky, and not at anything else. You could lie there and feel good and sing a little song to yourself, and not bother about anything else. And then Jonathan began to talk about Tinjil. I didn't want to remember him, but I still said, "What do you mean that Tinjil's time will come?" "That what happens to him is what happens to all tyrants sooner or later," said Jonathan. "That he'll be crushed like a house and be gone forever." "I hope that it's soon," I said. Then Jonathan murmured quietly, "Though Tinjil is strong and he has Katla," he said that horrible name again. I wanted to ask him about it, but I let it be. It was good to not know about anything about Katla on such a lovely morning. But then Jonathan said something that was worse than anything else. "Scotty, you're going to be alone at Knight's farm for a little while, because I must go away to Wild Rose Valley." How could he say something so awful? How could he think that I would stay at Knight's farm another minute without him? If he intended to rush straight into Tinjil's jaws, then I intended to go with him, and I told him so. Then he looked at me peculiarly and said, "Scotty, I only have one brother, whom I want to protect from all evil. How can you ask me to take you when I need all of my strength for something else, something that is very dangerous?" What he said didn't help. My sadness and anger were raging inside of me, and I screamed at him, "And you, how can you ask me to stay alone at Knight's farm and wait for you, and you might never come back?" Suddenly I remembered how it felt during the time when Jonathan was dead and gone from me, and I laid on my kitchen sofa, not knowing for sure if I would ever see him again. Oh, it was like looking down into a black hole when I thought about it, and now he wanted to leave me again, just disappear into a dangerous situation that I didn't know anything about, and if he didn't come back, then this time there wouldn't be any help. I'd always be alone. I felt myself becoming angrier and angrier, and I shouted at him even more, and said as many spiteful things as I could think of. It wasn't easy for him to calm me down, even a little, but it's clear that he got what he wanted at last. I knew that he understood everything better than I did. "Silly, you know I'll come back," he said. That was in the evening, as we sat and warmed ourselves by the fire in our kitchen, the evening before he would leave. I wasn't mad any longer, just sad, and Jonathan knew it. He was so kind to me. He gave me freshly baked bread with butter and honey on it, and he told me sagas and stories, but I couldn't listen. I thought about the saga of Tengil. I began to think that it was certainly the cruelest of all sagas. I asked Jonathan why he had to undertake something so dangerous. He could easily sit at home by the fire at Knight's Farm and be happy, but then Jonathan said that it was something he must do, even if it was dangerous. Why, I wondered, otherwise you're not a human being, but just a piece of dirt, said Jonathan. He told me what he was going to do. He was going to try to rescue Orvar from Katla Cavern, because Orvar meant even more than Sophia, and without Orvar it was probably the end of Nangiala's green valleys. It was late in the evening now. The embers died down in the fireplace, and night had come. Then the day came, and I stood by the gate and watched Jonathan ride away into the mist. Yes, it was misty over Cherry Valley that morning, and believe me, it nearly broke my heart to stay there and watch the mist take him, to see how he just faded away and disappeared, and I was left alone. I didn't want to stay here. I went crazy with grief, and I ran into the barn over to Fyalar and jumped up into the saddle and set out after Jonathan. I needed to see him one more time before I lost him, maybe forever. He would go to Tulip Farm first to get his orders from Sophia. That much I knew, so I would ride there. I rode crazy like a fool, and I caught up with him just past our farm. Then I almost felt ashamed and wanted to hide. But he had already seen me and heard me. "What do you want?" he said. Well, what did I really want? "Are you sure you're coming back?" I mumbled. It was the only thing I could come up with to say. Then he rode up beside me, and our horses stood quietly next to each other. Jonathan brushed something away from my cheek, tears or whatever they were, with his forefinger, and he said, "Don't cry, Scotty, we'll meet again. Definitely, and if it's not here, then it'll be in Nungilima." Nungilima, I said. "Now what's that?" "I'll tell you about it another time," said Jonathan. "I don't understand how I stood that time when I was alone at Knight's Farm, and how I passed the days. I looked after my animals, of course. I was almost always in the barn with Fyalar, and I sat for a long time and talked with my rabbits. I fished a little while and swam and shot at the target with my bow and arrows, but everything felt so pointless when Jonathan wasn't with me. Sophia brought food for me now and then, and we talked about Jonathan. I always hoped she would say, "He's probably coming home soon now," but she never said it. I also wanted to ask her why she hadn't gone to try and save Orvar herself instead of sending Jonathan, but why should I ask? I already knew. Tinjil hated Sophia. Jonathan had explained it to me. Sophia in Cherry Valley and Orvar in Wild Rose Valley, they are his worst enemies, and you can be sure that he knows it, said Jonathan when he told me how things were. He has Orvar in Katla Cavern, and he really wants to put Sophia in there too, to pine away and die. The coward, he's promised 15 white horses as a reward to the person who puts Sophia in his hands, dead or alive. Jonathan told me that, so I understood why Sophia needed to stay away from Wild Rose Valley. It was Jonathan who had to go there instead. Tinjil didn't know about him. At least that's what they thought and hoped, though someone had understood that Jonathan wasn't just a little gardener. The one who had been in our room that night, the one who I had seen over by the sideboard, the one Sophia couldn't help being worried about. That man knows too much, she said, and she wanted me to get a message to her immediately if anyone else came poking around at Knight's farm. I said that it was no use for anyone to try the sideboard again, because we had moved the secret papers to a new place. Now we had them in an oat bin out in the tack room, and a large tin box lying hidden under the oats. Sophia went with me into the tack room and dug up the tin box, and put a new message in it. It was a good hiding place, she thought, and I thought so too. "Hold out, if you can," said Sophia, as she left. "I know that it's hard, but you must hold out." It really was hard, especially in the evenings and at night. I had terrible dreams about Jonathan, and I worried about him every moment. I was awake too. One evening I rode down to the Golden Cockerel. I couldn't stand just sitting at home at Knight's farm. It was so quiet there, my thoughts were too loud, and they weren't thoughts to be happy about. I assure you that everyone stared at me when I strode into the inn without Jonathan. "What now?" said Josie. "Only half of the brothers Lionheart. What have you done with Jonathan then?" Now this was difficult for me. I remembered what Sophia and Jonathan had preached. Whatever happened, I must not tell anyone what Jonathan was doing or where he had gone, not to a living creature. So I pretended that I hadn't heard Josie's question. But Hubbard was sitting there by the table, and he wanted to know too. "Yes, where is Jonathan?" he said. "Doesn't Sophia know what's happened to her little gardener?" "Jonathan is out hunting," I said. "He's up in the mountains hunting wolves." I had to say something, and I thought this was a good idea, because Jonathan had said there were wolves everywhere in the mountains. Sophia wasn't at the inn that evening, but otherwise the whole village was there as usual, and they sang their songs and were happy as usual. But I didn't sing with them, because for me things were not as usual. Without Jonathan I didn't enjoy it there, and I didn't stay very long. "Don't look so sad, Carl Lionheart," said Josie. "When I left, Jonathan will be finished hunting soon, and then he'll come home." Oh, how I liked him for saying that. He patted me on the cheek and gave me some delicious cakes to take home with me. "You can nibble on these while you're sitting at home waiting for Jonathan," he said. He was kind, the Golden Cockerel. I felt a little less alone because of him. I rode home with my cakes and sat in front of the fire and ate them. It was a warm spring now, by day almost like summer. I still needed a fire in our big fireplace because the warmth of the sun hadn't come through the thick brick walls of our house yet. It felt cold when I crawled down on my bench, but I was soon asleep, and I dreamed of Jonathan. A dream so horrible that it woke me up. Yes, Jonathan, I cried, I'm coming. I cried as I dashed out of bed. In the darkness around me were echoes of wild cries, Jonathan's cries. He had shouted to me in the dream. He wanted my help. I knew it. I heard him, and I wanted to rush right out into the dark night to go to him, wherever he was. But soon I knew how impossible that was. What could I do? No one was as helpless as me. I could only crawl down on my bench again, and I laid there and trembled and felt lost and little and scared and alone, more than anyone else in the world, I thought. It didn't help much when morning came, and it was a bright, clear day. Of course it was more difficult then to really remember how strange the dream was, but Jonathan crying for help, I would never forget that. My brother had called to me. Shouldn't I try to go and find him? I sat outside for hours with my rabbits and brooded on what I should do. I had no one to talk to, no one to ask. I must decide for myself. I couldn't go to Sophia. She would stop me. She wouldn't let me leave under any circumstances. She wasn't crazy because it was pretty crazy. I think could I do it? And it was dangerous too. The most dangerous thing of all, and I wasn't brave at all. I don't know how long I sat there, leaning against the wall of the barn, pulling up the grass. I tore out every blade of grass around me, but I didn't notice until afterward, not while I sat there in torment. Hours passed, maybe. I would still be sitting there if I hadn't suddenly remembered what Jonathan had said, that sometimes you have to do things that are dangerous, otherwise you weren't a human being but just a piece of dirt. Then I decided. I pounded my fist on the rabbit cage so that the rabbits jumped, and I said loudly so that it would be certain, I'll do it, I'll do it. I am not a piece of dirt. Oh, how good it felt after I had decided. I know that it's right, I said to the rabbits, because I had no one else to talk with. The rabbits, yes, they would become wild rabbits now. I picked them up out of the cage, and then I carried them in my arms out to the gate and showed them the lovely green cherry valley. The whole valley is full of grass, I said, and there are lots of other rabbits you can be with. I think you'll have much more fun than in your cage. Only you must be careful of the fox and of Hubbard. All three seemed a little surprised, and they took a few small hops as if they wondered whether this could be right, but then they sped away and disappeared and became lost among the green hills. And quickly I began getting things in order. I gathered what I wanted to take with me, a blanket to wrap around me when I needed to sleep, a tinder box to make a fire with, a feed bag full of oats for Fiolar, and a bag of food for myself to eat. Well, I had nothing but bread, but it was the best bread, Sophia's round loaves. She had given me a whole stack, and I stuffed the bag full. It would be enough for a while, I thought, and when it was gone, then I'd have to eat grass like the rabbits. Sophia would come with soup the next day, she had promised, but by that time I'd already be long gone. Poor Sophia, she'd have to eat her own soup then, but I couldn't let her come here and wonder where I'd gone. She would have to know, though not until it was too late to stop me. I took a bit of coal out of the fireplace and wrote in huge dark letters on the kitchen wall, Someone called to me in a dream, and I'm searching for him far, far away beyond the mountains. I wrote strangely because I thought that if someone other than Sophia came to Knight's farm, someone that came to Snoop, then he wouldn't know what it meant. Maybe he would think that I had tried to put together a poem or something, but Sophia would understand at once what I meant. I am gone looking for Jonathan. I was happy, and for once I felt brave and strong. I sang to myself, Someone called to me in a dream, and I'm searching for him, far, far away, away beyond the mountains. Oh, how good it sounded. I'll remember to tell all this to Jonathan when I find him, I thought. If I find him, I thought. But if not, then my courage fled all at once. I became a little piece of dirt again, a scared little piece of dirt like I had always been. And then, as usual, I longed for Fyalar. I had to get to him immediately. It was the only thing that helped a little bit. When I was sad and anxious, how many times had I stood in his stall? With him when I couldn't manage to be alone. How many times had it comforted me to look into his wise eyes and to feel his warmth and his soft nose. Without Fyalar, I couldn't have lived through this time when Jonathan was gone. I ran to the barn. Fyalar wasn't alone in his stall. Hubbard stood there. Yes, Hubbard stood there petting my horse, and he grinned when he caught sight of me. My heart began to thump. He's the traitor, I thought. I think I'd known it for a long while, and now I was certain. Hubbard was the traitor. Why else would he come here to Knight's farm and snoop? The man knows too much, Sophia had said, and Hubbard was that man. I understood it now. How much did he know? Did he know everything? Did he know what we had hidden in the oat bin, too? I tried not to show how scared I was. What are you doing here? I said as sternly as I could. What do you want with Fyalar? Nothing, said Hubbard. I was on my way to see you, but I heard your horse neigh, and I like horses. He is fine, Fyalar. You can't trap me, I thought, and I asked, what do you want with me then? To give you this, said Hubbard, and he held something out to me that was wrapped in a piece of white material. You looked so sad and hungry last night. I thought maybe you were short of food here at Knight's farm, since Jonathan is away hunting. Now I didn't know what to say. I muttered a thank you, but I couldn't take food from a traitor, or could I? I fumbled with the material and took out a large piece of mutton. It was dried and smoked, the kind that tastes so good. A cold leg of lamb. It smelled delicious. I wanted to sink my teeth into it immediately, although I really shouldn't have told Hubbard to take his mutton and go far away. Anyway, I didn't do it. It was Sophia's job to deal with the traitor. I had to pretend that I didn't know or understand anything. Besides, I really wanted to have that cut of lamb. Nothing would be better in my bag of food. Hubbard was still standing with Fyalar. You're really a fine horse, he said, almost as fine as my Blenda. Blenda is white, I said. Do you like white horses? Yes, I love white horses, said Hubbard. Then you would want 15 of them, I thought, but I didn't say it. Instead, Hubbard said something frightening. Shouldn't we give Fyalar a few oats? Shouldn't he also have something good? I couldn't stop him. He went right into the tack room, and I ran after him. I wanted to shout, leave it alone, but I didn't get out a word. Hubbard opened the lid of the oat bin and got the scoop and laid on top. I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see him fish up the tin box, but I heard him swear, and then I opened my eyes and saw a little rat dive over the edge of the oat bin. Hubbard tried to kick her, but she ran away across the barn floor, disappearing into a secret hole. She bit my thumb, the rascal, Hubbard said. He stood there looking at his thumb. And then I took a chance. Quickly, I filled the scoop with oats, and then I shut the lid right in front of Hubbard's nose. Now Fyalar will be happy, I said. He isn't used to getting oats at this time of day. But you're not happy, I thought, as Hubbard abruptly said goodbye and slipped out through the barn door. This time he didn't get his claws on any of the secret messages, but it was necessary to find a new hiding spot. I thought for a while, and at last I buried the box down in the potato cellar, inside the door on the left. And then I wrote a new riddle on the kitchen wall for Sophia. Red wants white horses and knows too much, be careful. I couldn't do anything more for Sophia. At sunrise the next morning, before anyone in Cherry Valley had risen, I left Knight's farm and rode up into the mountains.